And he has like Latin lover Riz.
Uncle Pastuso canonically has Riz.
Yes.
He's got game.
Yes.
Hello, and welcome to the Gifted Child Symposium podcast, where we discuss the contributions of some of the most significant political figures of our time, those who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right and represent their communities, such as, naturally, Paddington Bear. I'm Felicia.
I'm Eugene. And yeah, welcome to another podcast. This will be hopefully very bearable. Bearable?
Okay, yeah, we need like a bear pun count. That's one.
We'll try to contain ourselves though. We're hoping that whoever's listening knows about Paddington. We didn't necessarily grow up with Paddington. I know a lot of British people did. I think Americans are catching up because of the recent movies, but just in case, I want to do a brief intro to the Paddington history, if you will, the
Paddington's
I'm trying to
origin.
do more bear puns. I'm like the multi-bears of Paddington. I'm trying.
I like that.
I'm proud. So, Paddington. Yes, a brief intro into the Paddington. Universe.
Universe. Yeah.
Yes. So Paddington is a character created by writer Michael Bond. And his first appearance was in Bond's children's book from 1958 titled A Bear Called Paddington. This first book follows Paddington from quote-unquote darkest Peru, that's his homeland, we'll talk about it, who is found at Paddington Station in London by a British family called the Browns, who take him in. So in this book and all of the dozens more that Bond wrote afterwards, we follow Paddington's adventures as he discovers and adapts to London and British society, and that results in a lot of funny misunderstandings, cute moments. It has a very wholesome brand of its own. And we don't think it's crazy to say that Paddington is a British icon. I think if you go to the UK at any given souvenir store, you'll see a million things of Paddington.
Yeah, no, totally. I think he is, as iconic as the Big Ben.
Yeah.
And red telephone boxes.
He's an icon in the way of he is iconic, but he's also literally an object, an icon of Britain. And even now, 60 years after the publication of the first book, he's still on shelves, he's still as a toy and as a book and as a story. He's been really embraced into the British iconography, imagination, imagery, all of that. According to the Telegraph, British tunnelers passed a Paddington Bear stuffed toy to their French counterparts when the two sides of the British Channel Tunnel were linked in 1994. That's how iconic he is.
That is so wild because it's not only within the UK he's an icon. They were this represents us as a nation to the French.
Yes. Can I say how iconic it is that with the context of immigration we'll be talking about, Paddington came on a boat to the UK and now they're forcing him back out the channel.
Via the channel.
I think to talk about his iconic status, we need to mention that during Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee in 2022, both of us were present for, there was a skit of Paddington having a chaotic afternoon tea with the Queen that was aired during her Jubilee, and it was very charming. And it somehow that escalated into Paddington becoming synonymous with the monarchy, and when specifically Queen Elizabeth, because of that really beloved skit. And when Queen Elizabeth passed away a few months later, many left Paddington Bear stuffed toys and flowers and signs as if they were kind of the same thing, as if they were one of the same, to remember the Queen. So that is wild. And lastly, the last thing that makes Paddington's legacy keep expanding is the movies. And I think that's how a lot of internationals or non-British people kind of had an understanding of Paddington, because we didn't grow up up with the books. The 2017 movie from the same director as, you know, Wonka, you know, that deeply impactful cultural moment. So that prolonged his popularity. And Paddington 2, which came out later, famously dethroned Citizen Kane on Rotten Tomatoes to become the best film in history. And that was very, very iconic.
Having never seen Citizen Kane, I fully agree with that ranking.
It was, the memes were amazing. And I don't know, I think Citizen Kane has been discussed to death, but Paddington has a lot to say, guys. And maybe this is why we need to open up the space for Paddington to speak in behalf of society and film history.
Yeah. I also want to point out on all over the London... Wait, actually, I'm not going to say this because this won't be relevant whenever this episode comes out. But I was going to talk about the Paddington experience.
Well, yeah, let's keep talking about how, like, now Paddington is like a whole thing, and now apparently there's like a Paddington experience in London. So like it's very relevant. It's not only a children's book. It has become huge.
Like you said, it is the Paddington multi-bears. Like it's like, you know, the identity of it is expanding. It's existing in multiple formats. If that's not a multiverse or a franchise, I don't know what is. The fact that the third book, like third movie, even they're gonna go to Peru.
Yes, there's not a single South American or Peruvian person cast in that film, by the way.
Shockingly, Ben Whishaw isn't Peruvian.
Or Olivia Colman. But anyway, how did you come to love Paddington?
Listen, I wish I could pinpoint a moment. Probably the movies, let's be real. Because, like, you know, Paddington, and I'm sure this is relatable to everyone who isn't British, Paddington just existed on, like, the edge of my realm of knowledge for a long time. I would, like, you know, go to Paddington Station and I'd be like, yep, Bear. He's there. What up? But then I saw the movie and I was like, oh my god, he is perfect. I love him. Like, he is the most precious being in this or any fictional universe.
He's so cute.
But like we've said, like, he is such a British icon. Like, he does, like, pop up in, like, every single souvenir shop. Like, he is like as a visual and as, like, an image, he do be the epitome of Britishness. But I didn't know he was Peruvian until the movie, which I think is interesting.
Same. My like Latino family also found that out very recently. Like, we went to Paddington Station and they didn't know. It was like an after the fact, and I think that is very important to remark upon, because genuinely for people outside of the UK, Paddington is just another thing. Like, I think I knew as much about the Beatles as I knew about Paddington, and to me they were synonymous. They were just like a thing that was important, and now it's like iconic. And I just came to like it because of how wonderful the films were and how cute they were.
I was gonna say, like, you know how, like, you know, during the Queen's Jubilee, it was a skit with Paddington. It's, like, super comparable to the skit the Queen did for the 2012 Olympics, but that was with James Bond. Like, Daniel Craig was in that. So Paddington is as British as, like, James Bond, who represents not just, like, Britishness, but, like, the British government. Like, he is MI6. You know what I mean? Like, Paddington is, like, to his core. Well, he was to his core in my brain, in, like, my cultural knowledge of him, through and through Anglo-Saxon British.
Yeah. And yet he's Peruvian, and he is a story written for and about immigration, which is very wild. And I think that's what we're most interested in. So to continue with the kind of introduction of it, Paddington is, like, written as an immigrant. That is the core of his story, besides being a bear. Michael Bond, the author, said that he was inspired to write Paddington based on his memories of seeing children waiting on station platforms in London during World War II. So very similar to Paddington, with, like, maybe just one suitcase with everything they owned and a tag with their names on them, because it is kind of unclear. There's, like, some interviews that made it seem like they were, like, British children waiting on platforms to be, you know, kind of like the Peter Pan children, like, taken away to the countryside because of World War II. There were other interviews that he seemed to say that he was referring to Jewish refugees coming into London. So I think they were both true. They're both apply. So yeah, they're children who are parentless, or at least like they don't have their primary caretakers with them, and they are just kind of, you know, very vulnerable and very lost, and they have like that image of like just kind of waiting to be in transition. And in 2014, because of how, you know, immigration has become such a contentious point in British politics. In 2014, he said that Paddington, this is, again, I quote from an interview, he said, Paddington, in a sense, was a refugee. And I do think that there's no sadder side than refugees.
Ignoring the, like, obvious, what's the word, like, pitiful tone and the slightly infantilizing tone of that statement, the heart is there and the intention is there. It is
very pitying at the same time that it is like, I think it at least, what's the name, like points to Bond's politics about what matters. Like he wrote like a very famous letter of Paddington himself kind of asking the British government to be more open to, you know, like in their immigration politics. He was vocally anti-Brexit and advocated for better treatment of immigrants and refugees during his life, especially children. And yeah, it was just very clear that he wanted to create a character that represented that sense of being an outsider in a very specific way into a society, especially when you're a child.
Yeah, and I think that specific way is the key here, because Paddington, like we've said, like we didn't know that he was Peruvian. We didn't know he was a refugee. Like we didn't know he was an immigrant until we saw like the actual movie. Because Paddington is a very sanitized version of an immigrant story, I'd say. Like he's very much portrayed as a model immigrant and conforming in many ways to being like a model minority stereotype. He's super polite. He speaks perfect English with a perfect RP accent. There is a reason for this, like, canonically. Like, his aunt and uncle met a British explorer while they were still living in Peru and got really into British culture, and it was always their dream to, like, move to London. But they learned English from this, like, British explorer, hence why they all speak with a perfect RP accent. Anyway, but yeah, basically, Paddington is, like, a very specific example of an immigrant because of all of these things, but also his entire narrative and like the stories that surround him and like the little stories that Michael Bond wrote were all him trying to assimilate into British society in various funny ways. So it's like interesting to interrogate that and how compatible his like immigrant Peruvian Latino identity, how compatible that is with his identity as a British icon who literally represents like the monarchy, the country, the nation's identity, like as a people.
Yeah. A nation that is still actively, and its government at the moment of recording, still very resistant to be more welcoming towards refugees and immigrants. And it's tightening their immigration politics. And yet an immigrant is representing that same government.
Exactly. Like the UK does have a history of immigration, like especially if you look at like certain areas of the UK and like especially of like London, for instance, and like Bristol, for instance. But like that narrative of immigration isn't at all central to the UK's narrative. Obviously, their history is not conducive to it. They were the ones going out rather than coming in. Where it can compare to like, you know, the US with like the whole Mayflower, like, you know, immigrants would get the job done. Like, you know, like Hamilton, Mayflower, even like people who are like, yeah, I'm like Irish because my great-great-great-grandparents came over on a boat. That isn't the case in the UK, even if there is a like immigration, like a history of immigrant identity, but they are always considered
like a monoculture.
The narrative of right, like they're not like Britain as like as a country, as like a history. So yeah, we just thought we'd hop on our mics and, you know, pick apart Paddington's extremely complicated and conflictive identity.
Yeah. I guess there's two parts of it to begin with, right?
Yeah.
And I want to talk about it first as like, this inception of Bond wanting to create a story about an immigrant, a story about a refugee. So Paddington the Immigrant. If we look at the Paddington lore, the Paddington multiverse, Paddington came to the UK Not only because of that explorer, which is such an easy sanitized way instead of saying conqueror, because he didn't conquer the bears, he just taught them English and gave them a hat, I guess, and told them they were always going to be welcome in the UK.
And he taught them how to make marmalade? Am I completely making that up? Yeah.
Or like he taught them about marmalade. So it is literally how I don't know, like Ron DeSantis will talk about colonization. like this really nice white guy came in and taught them like a life skill and then left.
Yeah, it's like the myth of the first Thanksgiving.
Oh yeah. Oh my god, yes. But instead of turkey, it's marmalade.
Yeah, exactly.
So Aunt Lucy and Uncle Pastuzo always wanted to emigrate because they had this sense of the UK being a welcoming place and also fascinating. Like they're shown like listening to tapes in the film and making models of the Big Ben. Like they're kind of fascinated by it in a way that I think resonates with a lot of immigrants. Like I also certainly was like, this is like a fairy tale land, but it's also like a fascinating place that I was obsessed with.
100%.
But they, at least in the film, which again, as a franchise, let's say that's canon.
It is.
So that the movies are giving way more to Paddington's past. So we open in Peru, and even though he's always wanted to immigrate, what pushes him to properly leave Peru is an earthquake that destroys his home in the rainforest, I guess, and like kills his uncle. It's a whole thing. It's a whole tragedy. So and that kind of and because Aunt Lucy is too old to take care of him and they don't have a home anymore, he's sent to the UK by himself, basically making him an underage environmental refugee if we were to go by like real standards of the world. There's also this other kind of part of his identity that is very linked to another very real part of immigration, which is Caribbean immigration in the UK, specifically in London. So that is worth mentioning, whether or not that was intentional. It probably was. Even though Michael Bond just kind of lived around Paddington and he thought that was a cute name. It is important to mention that Paddington Station was a point of arrival for thousands of Caribbean immigrants during the same time, like during the 50s and 60s. This is what we like very famously became the Windrush generation, what has changed British and London identity. And the fact that then Paddington's like adopted family, there we go, live in Notting Hill, which is also a neighborhood in London that became a hub for the Caribbean community and also a hub for racial tensions and the center of race riots just a year after the first Paddington book was published. It is I think it is very relevant, and it is linking Paddington to a tradition of immigration, intentionally or unintentionally.
Completely side note, imagine if he was called literally any other station, like Victoria Bear or Euston Bear.
I mean, I think the station that is the most like associated with Caribbean immigration is Waterloo Station. Waterloo the Bear. It's cute.
That's not bad. It's better than like Liverpool Street Bear, you know? Waterloo Bear. I would.
Waterloo's cute.
Waterloo is very cute.
There's a statue of a Caribbean family. Like a giant statue of a Caribbean family in Waterloo Station that honestly is very evocative of the Paddington statue of Paddington Station.
The two immigrant tributes.
Narratives.
The two immigrant narratives that make up the fabric of London, I'd say.
Yeah. Immortalized in the same ways.
Yeah. Anyway.
But Paddington isn't Caribbean. As much as the history links it, he is from quote-unquote darkest Peru. Let's talk about it, y'all.
Yeah.
What the fuck is darkest Peru? The way that sometimes I have told people Paddington is Latino, he's from Peru, and they go, no, he's from darkest Peru. Excuse me?
There's no words. Just please explain why this is happening.
I know. So basically, the thing that is worth mentioning is that Bond originally wanted Paddington to be from darkest Africa, which is... Yes, Michael Bond is woke. Yes, I'm so grateful for him. But oh my god, boy.
He was writing in the 50s. Gotta give him some lenience. That being said, darkest Africa is nonsense.
It is so bad. And I think the darkest Peru, darkest Africa thing really betrays the undertones of even the most well-intentioned, lovely British man will have these biases. Because dark is Africa. So this is like legit. There are manuscripts and first drafts of A Bear Called Paddington. The HarperCollins website has one where in the, like literally in the original one is like he was from darkest Africa. But he changed it, not because of racism, but because his publisher told him that there were no bears in Africa. So he settled for Peru because he found that there was a species of bears that were, and I quote, this is Bond's words, about the right size and nothing much is known about them, which seemed a good thing, end quote. Also, Bond said in that same register that darkest, quote unquote, added a touch of mystery, end quote. So that is where the whole darkest thing comes from.
I wish we could spend the whole episode just like unpacking that, because he really said touch of mystery. He said darkest is exotic. It's giving...
He literally said exotic Peru.
Oh, God, like I'm just like thinking back to all of our critical race study of seminars in uni, like, you know, the impenetrable nature of the word, like dark and black and like all of the optics of it. Ugh, Michael Bond. You did so much and yet...
He is at least not a black bear.
It's true.
So that, the whole mystery thing is, again, it just betrays the culture of Britain, the culture Michael Bond was for, and his biases. So there's an essay titled Paddington Bear, A Case Study of Immigration and Otherness by Angela Smith, because people have been talking about this for longer than we have, and I love it. So here Angela Smith links this original intention of Paddington's home being darkest Africa and Bond's ideas about mystery with the works of Henry Morton Stanley, who was an explorer and journalist of the Victorian era, who wrote a bunch of books about his imperial, of course, travels through Africa, including a book called In Darkest Africa. So Smith in this essay writes that by using the adjective darkest, Morton Stanley, the explorer, was, and I quote, reflecting the Europeans' view of the mystery of the vast continent and referring to the dark-skinned races he encountered there. His real-life adventures inspired children's stories as well as those intended for a more adult readership, which drew on the imperialistic assumption that Africa was a continent in need of civilizing, its people at best portrayed as novel savages. Therefore, the mystery Bond refers to is tied uncomfortably up in a colonial past that will become part of the underlying message in these books, where Britain was largely, but not wholly, uncritically presented as a good thing. End quote. I feel like we could end the episode there. Like it's like an incredible analysis. So there are of course a lot of racist undertones in Paddington in that way, and I think even if he changed it to Darkest Peru in the end, and it kind of separates to that imperial lineage. Which I think benefits Paddington. I think it would be so cancelled if it was Darkest Africa and it would not have had the impact. It still benefits from the same structures of power, which is this exoticization and purposeful ignorance of a foreign country. Yeah. In this case, Peru, which is, if anything, more helpful than the British imagination knows even less about Peru than they knew or they know about Africa now. And it relies on the sense of Peru not being a real place, and being able to be unscrutable and exotic, that anything can come from there and we don't really need to spend much time there.
Yeah. I find it interesting though that he picked Peru, like as a specific country, I should say, as opposed to Darkest Africa, which is a whole ass continent. Like
Darkest America.
Just interested in that choice. Like it wasn't, I don't know, Darkest Kenya. I don't know. You know, like
I know. No, he just thought he just thought it was the same thing.
Yeah, Michael Bond. Well, is he dead? You keep saying past tense. Did he die?
Yes.
Okay. Rest in peace, but also why did you do that though?
No. Like I love him. But but like Darkest Africa boy?
Yeah. And the other thing I think to mention when it comes to Michael Bond and his you know, he was a white man. What can you do? He was a white British man trying his best, I think. Paddington's name Obviously, that's Paddington isn't his birth name. It's the name that he was given when he arrived to London because he was found at Paddington Station. The reason why he gets given that name is because, and this is canonical, his name is too difficult to pronounce for the Browns.
Yes.
And there's two versions of this, right? Like in the movies, bless their hearts, created in the 21st century, they were like, we can't get canceled. The reason is that Paddington's birth name isn't Bear, so it's like this growl. Like humans literally cannot pronounce it because they can't growl. In the original book, the reason why he gets given Paddington as a name is because his name is in Spanish and therefore unpronounceable.
Yeah, it is wild. That is another thing of Paddington that really links him to the immigrant identity of just being given a name by some random white woman because she refuses to try to pronounce yours.
Yeah.
Which, in the original, Paddington's name was Pastuso, which is not hard, but also I guess sounds similar to Paddington. But yeah, it's not hard, and it is insane.
This 100% relates to like what we're going to talk about and like the sort of Britishization of Paddington's identity, like even his name, like he isn't allowed to keep his totally pronounceable Spanish name in favor of like this historic London location. Like, you know, like it's not even like a name in itself. It's like it's a name of a location in London. Like it's even rooted to the location. There's an essay called British Empire and Post-Empire Children's Literature by Hunt and Sands, in which they write, it would appear that Paddington sacrifices all he knows in order to achieve kinship with England. This includes not only his language, but his name as well.
Very, I don't know, accurate to, I guess, the immigrant experience and the experience of having to adapt to survive, of, yeah, compromising your identity, your name, your language in order to fit in. And
just making it easier, you know, for the very generous British people who are taking you in so kindly. But anyway, Paddington, nonetheless, achieves the status of model immigrant, model citizen. And he's also, like, not just, like you know, a pretty good citizen, like just generally speaking, he's like a model British citizen. Like he like upholds like specifically British values to the extent where people just like straight up don't know that he's Peruvian. Even like people who grew up on the books, like British people, like having taken a straw poll of our British partners and friends, none of them really knew that he was Peruvian. Or if they did, it was again like sort of tangential to his actual identity, which is the most polite, upstanding citizen you'll ever meet. It's just a circumstantial fact that exists in a void to them, like his Peruvian origins. So for the shits and giggles, I decided to take the citizenship test, the British citizenship test, as Paddington. And also, I want to point out the very funny fact that the British citizenship test is called Life in the UK, like, test. I don't know why I find that really funny. But anyway, I took it as Paddington, just like one of those sample tests you can find online, and I failed. I got 13 out of 24. Few things to note on this very scientific experiment. I was just guesstimating like what a 5-year-old bear would like know about history and like common sense. So take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. Secondly, the Life in the UK test is bullshit and is not, in my opinion, sorry to the Home Office, a very good measure of how well someone would integrate into British society. Like, just because you know who Henry VIII's third wife was doesn't mean you'll necessarily fit in, quote unquote, in the UK. It's like super arbitrary. It's like name 3 soap operas on TV currently, or like really like vague questions about like, I think there was one that was like, which one of the following is considered a British value? And it'd be like lying, anarchy, and like honesty or something. Like, you know, like it's like really arbitrary, really like wishy-washy statements on like British culture and morals.
It's so weird because I guess I'm so used to hearing about the American citizenship test, which is just like facts, which again, most Americans don't know necessarily like who the whatever president is or the representative, and they should. but there is a level of like just studying for a test and you knowing your government. This seems so stressful about like values, like literally fitting in and like knowing soap operas, like the British identity is so tied to this monoculture still.
Yeah.
And then the British like legal identity is also linked to culture.
Exactly. And like it's interesting as well that this is what they deem like is like makes you fit for living in the UK and like staying in the UK, because like they're also quite outdated. Like my British partner would not pass this test necessarily. Like he'd probably have to study because he doesn't necessarily know like these random history tidbits. And also it's kind of outdated. Like, you know, like most people our age don't really watch soaps. Like they probably like maybe you'd be able to name them just because like your family member watches them or whatever. But it's not going to be a part of your life or identity, Coronation Street or whatever it is. But anyway, this is all to say that Paddington would not pass the British citizenship test, but that doesn't matter because he'd be naturalized by the Browns.
Well, that to be discussed.
Yeah, no, we will get to this. The point though isn't Paddington's legal status as a British citizen. It's all the ways in which he embodies UK moral standards. Like he's polite, like unfailingly polite, like maybe to the point where he's a little bit irritating polite in the way the British people are. Like if he had a mean bone in his body, he'd be passive aggressive. He's awkward and just like a little bit charmingly awkward in like the way all your favorite British male leads are.
Yeah.
In fact, Michael Bond, in an interview with The Guardian, literally said that Paddington was largely inspired by his father, who he describes as a mild sort of person. He was a manager working for the post office and a stickler for the rules. Just really polite, and he always wore a hat. So Michael Bond very specifically was inspired by, you know, the stereotypical idea of a model British citizen for this character, a bear.
Literally a white British man.
Yeah.
This is why Ben Whishaw is Paddington.
Yeah. Like, without a doubt. Yeah.
Like, he's also the model citizen in the way that he doesn't riot. You know, it's a good model for kids. I get it. He's still standing up for what matters. But the whole idea of whenever he's upset or whenever someone doesn't want to give him the time of day, Paddington gives him the hard stare. And it's a children's book, so it's meant to be like actually effective and endearing, and it's really lovely. It's so cute. I love it. But in the context of like political stuff, it's like, oh, someone was like, you know, racist towards me, and Paddington, the representative of all immigrants but also all Britishness, is like, oh, just stare at them.
Yeah, just like stare at them until they realize they were like being naughty. Like, you know, it's very like, ooh, like school values. If you're honest and upstanding, then everyone else around you will do the same. Treat others as you would like to be treated. Like very, very cutesy. Because like he is a kids.
Yeah, we get it. We get it.
Like, we get it. Like it's fine. He serves a point. He serves a purpose. Okay. I'm also going to bring in the definition of the word model minority here, because citizen is a wishy-washy term. I don't know if Paddington has a passport. Is he allowed to have a passport?
Is like the Queen? Like he doesn't need one.
Like he's literally not allowed to have one. But according to my favorite source, Wikipedia, the term model minority refers to a minority group defined by factors such as ethnicity, race, or religion, whose members are perceived to be achieving a higher socioeconomic status in comparison to the overall population average. So just an immigrant, for instance, who rises above the socioeconomic average in the country. For Paddington, this is essentially a moot point, but I'm going to bring it up anyway, because for him, he never had to like hustle in the sense of like earning his living, because he was adopted by the Browns, who are, you know, the father is a banker, I want to say.
Yeah.
He has like a very stereotypical like white collar job, I think. They clearly can afford a very nice house, a huge house, in fact, in Notting Hill, a very wealthy
Now
area.
very posh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about in the 50s, but I'm sure. Anyway, they are super wealthy. They're really nuclear. They literally have 2.5 kids. Paddington is obviously the 0.5. And yeah, like Paddington, by joining the Browns, by just immediately seamlessly entering this country via this already super molded family, he bypasses the whole immigrant hustle, blah, like, narrative. So the whole like socioeconomic thing, again, I know it's a kid's story, but we're here to overanalyze, is also erased from his immigrant narrative, let's say.
Yeah, and he's also a model minority in the way that because he doesn't have to struggle and he doesn't have to take in like lower paying jobs to survive.
Yeah.
He doesn't fit into that narrative of an immigrant taking jobs or an immigrant being a burden of society. He doesn't have to rely on public schooling, or he doesn't have to rely on welfare because he's adopted into a really wealthy family.
Yeah.
So he bypasses all of the negative stereotypes of immigrants.
Yeah. That being said, though, he does have to sort of earn his keep, especially in the beginning when he first meets the Browns. At least I'm sure in the books as well. But like, Mr. Brown is like not super on board with taking in this bear in the beginning. Like, he's skeptical. He's like, oh my God, he doesn't know how to use a toothbrush or whatever. So he does have to like, quote unquote, earn his keep with the Browns. Like, he has to like deserve to stay with this like model household. Like, he has to like go on these kooky adventures where he helps out his neighbor. He has to befriend his neighbors. He has to, learn the customs before he gets to stay for good. But Paddington is quote unquote not like other immigrants / bears, because he assimilates without too much trouble. Like, he does learn the customs. He makes friends with the neighborhood really easily. He's out here like stopping crime on day 2. Like, he's good. And you know what I immediately thought of, because my brain is broken? I thought about Bella becoming a vampire and how she has like super control.
Stop it.
Anyway, you can cut that.
Yeah, I'm gonna cut that. I know exactly what you mean, but we don't have time for.
No,
I know exactly what you mean.
My brain is broken. He's just a stand-up bear.
Yeah.
And also just like optically as well, he doesn't have an accent because he learned English via a British explorer. I don't know why he, like, surely he, anyway. But like optically
really
he doesn't. He's really cute. He's non-threatening.
Oh my God, we said the same thing.
Yeah.
Again, as we were talking about the optics, he is a great symbol. Like, that is, like, it is so ironic that he has now kind of become synonymous with Queen Elizabeth and the monarchy and Britishness in general, because he's just a teddy bear. Like, he's like the Mickey Mouse, like Mickey Mouse in a way is like a symbol of imagination at the same time that it's a symbol of capitalism, like he is just like a really lovable object. But that, for an object to be an object, it requires his identity, his past, to kind of be removed from him. Like, he's literally just like a symbol. And I think the fact that he's so cute and huggable and non-threatening, Paddington can be anything. And then his story doesn't add to any levels of discomfort for British people or white people. He can be an immigrant narrative, but that's kind of second nature to him being a bear.
Yep. Yeah. And that whole identity and that whole dynamic, if you will, like, is really conducive to them, like Michael Bond, Paddington's creators, portraying the UK as this like really open and accepting place, because the Browns are like, a very stereotypical white British family, and like, especially like Mr. Brown coming around to like accept, like Mr. Brown coming around to accept Paddington as well, like, even though he's like, skeptical in the beginning, is like, wow, the UK is so like, like they just get the job done, like they just like work so hard, and they have such good morals that they always come to the right conclusion, because at their core, their values are conducive to being like, neighborly. which, you know, is optimistic.
Yeah.
Because, like if we want to connect this to reality, there is a well-known article by Colin Yeo, a British immigration lawyer, in which he reviews Paddington's illegal arrival to the UK and examines if his chances of being granted asylum are like how likely they are. But he concludes that if Paddington was a person asking for asylum, he would most likely be deported back to Peru.
Yeah. So it's the perception of Britain as a very welcoming place, which it can be, versus I think the maybe more recent and more legal reality is, I think, at odds. Because in the end, Paddington, and I think what we're getting at is that Paddington is not necessarily a symbol of immigration for the sake of the immigrant narrative, is a symbol of immigration for the sake of the white middle class British family who looks at the immigrant. Like it wants us to see a lovable, helpless, saddest side of a refugee who we want to take home. And that is the lesson to kind of be more open to even quirky little dudes. But it ends up being that the arc is on the people becoming accepting of him, and he's not threatening. And the only way that your average British like family would accept an immigrant is if they are as adorable and not burdensome as a bear. You don't have to feed him. You just have to make him make his own marmalade. You know, that is what we're getting at, is this, as we said, the conflictive identity of Paddington is also the conflictive identity of the UK, and how it perceives itself, but also how Paddington has changed. Because I think when we're talking about Paddington in the 50s, this narrative is very important, and even targeted towards welcoming immigrants is now very important now. But when we're talking about how open the UK is, or how we're prioritizing white middle class British narratives over maybe an interesting immigrant from Peru, that is where I think our curiosity has come into how Paddington is translated now, which took me to reading more Paddington books. They're short. They're children's books. Because I was just like, there has to be more mentions, right, of him being Peruvian. Like, I understand that our friends don't necessarily clock it because they watched the BBC adaptation based on a bear called Paddington from 58. I started basically close reading Paddington, because why else did we do an English degree if it's not to close read? Paddington Bear. So the first book, the 1958 one, A Bear Called Paddington, actually has more mentions of Lima, Peru, and South America in total than it does London.
That is so interesting. And why is Lima mentioned?
Because he's from there. He's from a city, but he's also from the rainforest. Don't even.
But so Lima is dark as Peru?
Yeah, no, like legit. It's just Peru. It's just Peru. Yeah, I hadn't considered that. Like, because Aunt Lucy is sent to the house for retired bears in Lima.
And that's dark as Peru.
Or neighboring Peru, like
is all of Peru dark as Peru? The fact that because I just assumed that the whole time they'd be like in this ambiguous rainforest, which I'm like, sure, dark as Peru, whatever. But now that you've brought in an actual city,
it's just Peru.
It's just Peru. Okay. Anyway.
No, that's fair. Like, that's so real. It's just Peru.
It's just Peru.
It's not a fictional Peru. It's just Peru. Yeah, so there's like in total like hella mentions of Lima and Peru and South America, more than there are of London and the UK. Obviously because the readers are like from London, but it's like still like worth remarking that like Paddington's Peruvian-ness or Latinidad or whatever we want, or immigration status, is not something Bond avoided talking about. In fact, there are beautiful moments in that first book in the 50s where Paddington, when asked by the Brown family, but also by Mr. Gruber, who is also an immigrant, he's very excited, and he spends like the whole afternoon talking about his past and talking about home. So even though being Peruvian and being an immigrant is not the focus of his story or the main focus of his story, it is still like a core part of his character. Which now brings us to Paddington Here and Now. That is the title of a book that was published in 2008, so 50 years after A Bird Called Paddington. And this is also just, like little cookie adventures of Paddington, still in the UK, he never ages. And it has as many mentions of Peru. If anything, is even more explicitly about being an immigrant. So for starters, there's like a lot of mentions of him being like an outsider, of him not knowing like what Halloween is, because he very explicitly says we didn't celebrate it in Peru, which whatever. I'm sure you do. I celebrate in Colombia, but it's fine.
But who knows what happens in darkest Peru / Lima?
Yeah, he doesn't know what pianos are because he's from Peru. Anyway, good night. He's a bear. I will excuse it. He's a bear. And then there's an amazing chapter or like little story called Paddington Spills the Beans. And I wish I could convey how freaking bizarre this chapter is. But just to summarize it, Paddington is gardening. But like as a plot point, not as like as a racist stereotype. So he's gardening.
Paddington is gardening in a model citizen sort of way, not
in a quirky children's book sort of way, not in a Mexican gardener US sort of way. So he's gardening, and there's a reporter that approaches him and kind of asks him about his immigration status and like what's the name, and quality of living, assuming that he's an illegal immigrant. And he ends up writing, because of Paddington's like little quirky misunderstandings about what the reporter means, and the reporter misunderstanding what Paddington is saying, the reporter ends up writing an insane piece about like that includes a claim that a flood of immigrants from Peru is about to hit the UK, which is honestly so funny because yes,
I love Paddington so much because I just like the universe in which he exists makes so little sense, because the entire premise is that he's quirky and he like struggles with like basic tasks or customs or whatever, or like miscommunicates because he's a bear. So he's like canonically a bear, and this is not a world in which bears are supposed to be able to speak. Like, he is just a bear. And this reporter is like, I just met this talking bear, but breaking news, a wave of immigrants are coming from Peru.
I know. It's so accepted that he's a talking bear.
Anyway.
No, it's wild. Like, but yeah, like it's such a weird chapter because I mean it's really nice, and it is very obvious that like the joke is on the reporter thinking that Paddington is a victim, that Paddington is an illegal immigrant, that Paddington is gardening for immigrant reasons. I'm
just loving this idea of like gardening bracket immigrant gardening bracket.
Paddington bracket bear. Yeah. And also like the idea that the reporter is like also a joke of like what's the name, like the sensationalist media that is claiming so many things about immigrants. So it's a really, really nice critique. There's also a lovely, amazing quote. I fucking loved it. So when Paddington tells the reporter where he's from, he says he's from darkest Peru. The reporter says, and I quote, "I've come across a good many Bulgarians and Poles coming over here to work, but I've never met anyone from darkest Peru before." End quote. Which is honestly every conversation I had for 5 years in the UK. Like, oh, I've met Polish people, I've met Mexicans, never met a Colombian. Okay, girl. Okay, sure.
Congratulations. Yeah, today's your day.
Insane. Yeah, like I'm here. Oh my god. And also, he refers to Paddington and other immigrants as desperate boat people, which is wild. He's like, oh yeah, you desperate boat people, like I know you're coming over. Paddington did come on a boat, to be fair.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Michael Bond knew what was up. Like, he must have had some conversations with actual immigrants to write this. Because this is so specific.
This is very, very specific, and it is really lovely. We evolve from Darkest Africa to this, I swear. People change, guys. Rest in peace, Michael Bond, we love you. And I gotta say, anyone who wants to get into Paddington, do read A Bear Called Paddington, but also to read this one. This one, the end chapter of Paddington Here and Now, is something I really want to talk about. It's so cute and it's so lovely. And it is, as you're saying, he actually gets the immigrant experience. He's talked to, or he has like incredible levels of empathy, I think, and research. It is lovely. So in this final chapter, Uncle Pastuzo, which in the universe of the books didn't die like in the films, he's not married to Aunt Lucy. It might be like, it's just like they're brothers, because he has been like adventuring through the world. While Aunt Lucy is in a old bear's home. Anyway, so so he comes over and he's like been adventuring through the world, and he like is wearing like a bunch of things for his travels. And when I tell you that he is the most Latino macho character I've ever seen in a children's book, let alone a Western children's book, he genuinely has like Latin lover vibes. And yes, God, that might be a bit problematic, but it's also so funny to have a little bear. He's also, they don't grow like in the films. Like he's the same height as Paddington, but he's like 40. And he has like Latin lover Riz.
Uncle Pastuzo canonically has Riz.
Yes.
he's got game.
Yes. So he like comes over and he's wearing his little poncho and he speaks Spanish throughout his entire visit, and he's always like slipping words, like, again, very much like how an Anglophone writes Spanglish, but like I'll forgive. Like he's always like, oh, mi sobrino to Paddington, and he's always like, oh, gracias, señora to Mrs. Baird. Mrs. Baird? Whatever.
Mr. Baird, because Bear is everywhere.
Mrs. Bird. There we go. Say it a lot of times. And he like flirts with Mrs. Bird. To the point that it is kind of implied that Mrs. Bird has a crush on the bear, on Uncle Pastuzo.
That's really fucking weird.
Like she describes him as having big brown eyes, and Mrs. Bird says, like, looks at him dreamily, whatever. So that's fucking weird, but it's really funny.
So I'm hoping they introduce this. No, fucking Pastuzo's dead in the movies, but I'm hoping they introduce this element of bears being playas in the third movie.
It's so good. Like, I know it's still like a Latin stereotype, but it is so funny. Also, are we saying Paddington like just hasn't grown up, right? But like, will he also go through puberty? Will he want to have female friends? Or male? We don't discriminate. Like, can bears and humans reproduce in this universe? Like, why would Uncle Pastuzo flirt with Mrs. Bird?
It's true. And this goes back to like what I was just saying about the Paddington universe, which is that the fact that they're bears is clearly not normal, but it's completely unacknowledged.
Yes. So it's like, ooh, this Latino man is flirting with me, not this bear.
How
and why?
Why indeed? Because this is Mrs. Bird is like, what's her name? Yeah, like Julie Walters.
Yeah.
In the movie.
Yeah.
But Pastuzo's also supposed to be old. Correct. Like, is he like a silver fox?
A silver bear! Yes! But anyway, so Pastuzo's iconic, and he spends the visit talking about like his travels in Latin America and how he's gonna go back to Peru or whatever. And the Browns get a bit worried that means Paddington is gonna want to go back to Peru, which is cute. Like, they're like, oh, we don't want to lose you, but maybe he's like homesick. And Paddington decidedly is like, no, I want to stay in London. Like, you all are my family. And Uncle Pastuzo kind of, like, he eventually leaves. Like, he eventually continues his travels. And he tells Paddington that, and I quote, home is where you hang your hat, which is really lovely. That's kind of like the takeaway of the chapter of the book. And the last illustration of the whole book is Paddington's little hat being hung on the door of his room in Portobello Road.
That's really cute.
It's so cute. Like, he gets it. Like, home is where your heart is. Home is where you hang your hat. Home is wherever you're at. It's probably the most accurate thing about the immigrant experience that Paddington has offered, or like the most like specific. And it was like truly lovely to have Paddington's acknowledgement of an acknowledgement of Paddington's identity as an immigrant, but also someone who like might belong somewhere else, might want to go back there, might have like ties to other people, other bears, other cultures, while also want to stay in the UK for now is just so lovely, and also like an acknowledgement of like of Latino culture and Spanish language. Like it was so specific and it was so lovely. So my question is, after that, why are we still considering why is Paddington not Latino to us then? Why is he not an immigrant?
I mean, it's because, we know the answer, and it's because, like, his British identity completely overrides anything else.
Yeah, that is also like a whole thing in that book and in like Paddington's story, where it is in the books, it is in the films. And I think that is at the core of like the heart of Paddington is the fact that he's from elsewhere and he's missing it and he's adapting. But I think there is a sense in not only like, yes, the story is targeted towards like the, you know, white middle class British family who's like adopting him, but it's also the sense of like people who've embraced Paddington now. I think have done it on models of immigration that are more based on like maybe like the last century, where we don't want to refer to Paddington as not British. Like, of course he's British. He's so British. He's with the Queen. But he's also Peruvian. And I think that is something that we have both encountered with, I think, like, white people or like, people who just exist in, like, a majority or dominant culture where they don't want to refer to us as, like, when we acknowledge our own difference, they kind of want to be like, no, of course, no, you belong. As if belonging was conditioned upon a singular identity. Which is so weird, because that is like what like the freaking 2017 film ends on. Like Paddington saying to Aunt Lucy on a letter that in London everyone is different and that means everyone can fit in. And the difference of his is like optical and like species biological, you know, like he is different, and yet he has become, I think, like, very British-sized by, like, his perception. So, like, I don't know, Michael Bond is telling us this, and, like, Paddington is this beautiful example of, like, not all immigrants want to be this one thing. Like, some of them don't have perfect English. Some of them want to be perceived like him. Like, he wants to say, like, I am from Peru. He talks about it all the time. And, you know, some immigrants are bears.
Some immigrants are bears.
And, like, belonging to British society, I don't think he ever calls himself British. You know? That's actually such a good point. He never refers to himself as British. It's other people who do. That doesn't mean he doesn't belong. That doesn't mean the Browns and London isn't his home. It's where he's hanging his hat. It is his home. It is where he belongs. He's still not necessarily self-identified as British. And if he does, I haven't read every single Paddington book, but if he does, he at least refers to himself as partially British, and he will forever be Peruvian. And yet other people...
He'll always be a bear.
Exactly, and he'll always be a bear.
He'll always be a bear.
It's an unchangeable thing and a beautiful thing. But also, like, somehow he's become a British icon because of other people's perception of him.
Yeah. I mean, again, it all comes back to the fact that he's based on a children's book character. Paddington is clearly not so much a palatable immigrant story as much as he is a palatable immigrant character. He was designed for a white British population to teach children about manners, tolerance, and just being a quote-unquote good citizen. So it makes sense that, like, his purpose in British society and British children's childhoods has largely defined his identity and his, like, sort of reputation. And yeah, like, we can, like, you know, we've talked about, like, the limitations of that, the limitations of that representation. Like, you know, obviously it's not, it wasn't supposed to be, and it's not the most nuanced or accurate representation of, like, the quote-unquote immigrant experience. That being said, like, not that there is a singular one, but what we have achieved, what Michael Bond has achieved through these, like, limitations and this, like, simplification of, like, the complexities of immigration and immigrant politics and immigrant identities, is that he's created a really sort of empathetic and accurate representation of the experience of being perceived as one thing or the other, which is a large part of the immigrant experience, like the perception of you that isn't at all up to you. Like, you are perceived whether you like it or not.
Yeah, as a gardener, as a desperate boat people, as a British icon. Do we have a choice?
No, you can be like perfect RP accent and a bear, and people will pick one or the other, and that's not up to you.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And like, I don't know, to me it makes sense, like what we've been talking about, like as the audience, but also like Paddington has these kind of dual sides, sadly. Well, not sadly, but like to us, it is a bit unfortunate that his immigrant Latino side has been undermined, but it's still there. And I think we are attaching ourselves, and like why we love Paddington and decided to do this episode is because we are attaching ourselves through to what we relate to the most. And Paddington still has these very unique sides to him that not a lot of children's stories have. It is like how you perceive Paddington is like a matter of experience. Like for immigrants and like for non-British people in Britain or other places, like he is a beacon of, you know, like especially for children's literature, of hope for an immigrant narrative and a Latino icon that sometimes has to do with the Queen, which also makes him a traitor. High key. And for British people, he is like a lesson in tolerance and loving the other, and a quirky little character that they can remember loving, even if, you know, they can obscure parts of him when they talk about him sometimes.
Yeah. But that is just like reading, watching, relating to anything. You pick the parts that you relate to the most.
Yeah, I think it's just that Paddington has become a cultural thing. And I think we both feel dissatisfied about how there is another side of him that I think the culture needs to embrace more.
Yeah. And you know what? I think we're timing this episode well, because after Paddington 3, whatever Peru they're calling it,
yes,
everyone will know where he's from, and it won't be a secret anymore, or it won't be hidden knowledge anymore.
In Peru, guys. Let's see how that is.
Yes. Yeah, we need to make a part 2 after that.
Yes. But yeah, like let's see how they depict Peru, I guess.
Oh my god.
But yeah, I mean, Paddington is still a wonderful story. I wanted to mention really quickly that to me, like, so my partner's mom is Colombian, and she arrived to the UK as a child, and like there's not a lot of Latino representation in the UK. There's not a lot of like children immigrants representation in the UK either. So for her, it was also like a beacon of hope. Latinos are very underrepresented, and also like a tiny minority in the UK. So to have Paddington, to at least have like his Spanish name and his Latinidad like even be mentioned, meant a lot to her. Why it doesn't necessarily mean a lot to me right now is because he can be so much more, but he's also just a bear. Like I think he is not enough, because in general, if he is the only Latino representation that, you know, my partner's mom had decades ago, and also the one that I feel like we have right now, is because I think Paddington is pointing at this lack of representation in general of like Latinos in the UK, and more immigrant stories that are like more diverse and more varied, and are less about the, you know, the model immigrant story, and more about a specific experience that highlights difference without seeing that as threatening to their belonging.
And I think like what I enjoy about our like you know, dissecting things in our podcast is that we analyze things that, you know, make little sense, but ultimately they carry meaning for someone out there, whether that's your partner's mom or, you know, whoever we haven't spoken to, I'm sure, like found meaning in the fact that Paddington is Peruvian, or Paddington, you know, you're related to Paddington this and that way, and that's meaningful. It's just not the end of the conversation. Yeah,
exactly. Like, he's also a great starting point for kids just like moving to a new school, or to a new to a new, I don't know, county. I think he has served his purpose of being that representation, and now he's like a lovely, entertaining character. And I think that just signals how much like more diversity and plural experiences we need. Because, you know, like when it comes to representation, this is over 50 years old. And Paddington has done his best, and he continues to do his best. He is amazing. He's doing great. We love him. But he can't do it all. He can't bear it all, I think. He's only 3'6", according to the book. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast, The Gifted Child Symposium. We really hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please leave us a review on whatever podcast platform you're listening on right now. It would really help us out. Also, please share us with your friends, family, and enemies. You can find us on Instagram at giftedcs.pod. We would love to hear from you.
So I think my favorite thing that you've ever told me in our 5 years of friendship is please share. Please share.
Is the etymology of Peru. Or the potential etymology of Peru. Like, we didn't have that many quirky thoughts about Paddington because he's quirky himself. But I think I've talked about Peru more in this episode than I've talked about Peru in my life. So I was like, yeah, let's discuss the Peru's etymology. This is not a fact. Peru the name place might come from an actual Quechua word. But the story I read, which I love, is that when Pizarro and other Spanish awful conquerors were landing in South America, they were asking people where they were in Spanish, obviously, incredible language barrier. And the local chief name at the area they had arrived to, which is now South America, maybe Peru, his name was Biru. So what I imagine is that the conversation went, where are we? In another language. Is he asking who I am? Where are we? Points at self. Peru? Me? Peru? Stupid conqueror goes, we are in Peru. And I love that. Can you imagine if I was just like, where are we? And you went Felicia, and I was like, yes, the land of Felicia.
The land of Felicia. I don't give a shit if this is true. I don't give a shit if it isn't true. This is it for me. This is so canonically fun. For me, the etymology of the word of the name Peru.
It's so fun. So much better than Colombia. I choose to believe. So much better than Columbus.
Oh God. Any day. I choose to believe in Peru.